Welcome to this class on neuroscience of human movement. In this class, we will be talking about some of the disorders that affect basal ganglia. So, in this class, we will take a couple of examples, one each for each kind of disorder, the hypokinetic disorders, where there is a difficulty in initiating or selecting movements, then hyperkinetic disorders in which it is difficult to suppress unwanted movements, right. Hypokinetic case is the case in which I am unable to perform intentional, volitional, wanted movements. Hyperkinetic case is this case in which I am producing movements that are not wanted, I am doing things that I do not want to do. How are these things even happening? Lesions of the basal ganglia happen due to multiple reasons. This may be due to infarct, this may be due to hemorrhage, this may be due to a tumor or abscess, and importantly this may be due to degeneration, and in some cases this may be due to the deposition of bilirubin, like in the case of kernicterus, which is caused due to neonatal jaundice, right, or copper, right, in which case it is called Wilson's disease. So, there are different reasons why basal ganglia function may be compromised. An important reason of course is degeneration. There are different disorders that affect different loops, and that means different functions are affected. If it affects the movement loop, different diseases can happen. Actually only a couple of these are presented. Parkinson's disease is a hypokinetic disorder and Huntington's disease is a hyperkinetic disorder. So, essentially Parkinson's disease is this disease that is caused due to the degeneration of the nigrostriatal pathway, right, or the death of neurons in the substantia nigra pars compacta. The dopaminergic neurons are compromised. Because of this reason, what happens? The striatal neurons no longer receive modulation of the cortical inputs or thalamus inputs, right. Because of this reason, what happens is that there is an inability to initiate movements. Classical signs of Parkinson's disease, we will discuss this in greater detail in future classes: stooped posture, masked face, freezing of gait, resting tremors, right, and many such other symptoms, right. So, the classic signs are shown, for example, stooped posture and the inability of this person to make the first step. This is also called as the fog episode or the freezing of gait episode. He is not able to make the first step, right. And if basal ganglia function is affected, for example, in the executive loop, then what happens? Disorders such as obsessive compulsive disorders, for example, frequent washing of the hands, right. Basal ganglia is implicated, its exact role is still not completely understood, but at least basal ganglia is implicated in executive functions or dysfunctions of the executive ability, such as OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, right. And importantly, in behavior, there is an inability for people to empathize with others, and there is an inability for people to respond to important social cues. Like I said in one of the previous classes, you have somebody else's pen on a table, usually there is an inhibition from picking up in front of that person. You want to pick it up and put in your pocket, it is socially unacceptable, you would not want to do it. But a person with a certain disease actually has no control over his behavior. So, what happens is that he knows that this is unacceptable. If you ask him, he will tell you so, yet he will pick it up and put it. So, specific problems, right. So, these are important behavioral disorders. Then mood, functions of mood or emotion motivation, right, depression. The exact pathophysiology of this disorder is not understood. There is a huge need to understand this disorder, this disease, as to why this happens, what is the exact pathophysiology of depression, right, poorly understood, right. So, these are the various disorders. For the purpose of this course, of course, we will focus only on the movement disorders part. So, what are the various loops that are affected? The motor loop, of course, and the oculomotor loop, the executive associated loop, the emotion motivation are the limbic loop. Of course, we said which areas of the cortex and which areas of the thalamus project to each other or project to the basal ganglia, and from the thalamus back to the cortex. How does this projection happens is something that we saw in a previous class. If one of these loops is compromised, then that particular function is affected. Actually, what happens is that in diseases, or especially neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's disease, it actually affects multiple pathways. It affects not just the motor function, although what is frequently and very well observed are the motor symptoms. There are of course other devastating effects that neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's disease has on other systems, for example cognitive ability, right. These are of course relatively poorly studied when compared with the motor dysfunction related with Parkinson's disease. Actually, the motor dysfunction related with Parkinson's disease itself still needs to be more understood. It is not completely understood, right. So, something that we will discuss in future classes. Essentially, movement disorders of the basal ganglia can be classified into two types. One is the hypokinetic type. This is the case when I want to perform a movement and I am not able to perform a movement. When the patient wants to perform a movement, wants to take a step, is not able to take a step. This is hypokinetic disorders. There are different manifestations of this. Akinesia, this is the inability to initiate or start a movement. For example, the freezing of gait episode, right. I am not able to take the first step, the patient is not able to take the first step, freezing of gait, right. Bradykinesia or slowness, general slowness, reduction in amplitude and velocity. So, this is also called bradykinesia. Then rigidity may be of multiple types. Then importantly in the case of Parkinson's disease, tremors, right. Yeah, this you see relatively old people, you may have seen have this problem, right. They do this and frequently they rub the index finger and the thumb tip with each other like that, right. Actually not exactly like this, I am not able to reproduce the actual movement, something like that, they do this, right. So, that tremor, right. And hyperkinetic disorders, right. In this case what happens is I am producing unwanted movements. In the previous case I wanted to do something and I am not able to do it. In this case I do not want to do something, but I am doing it, right. Unwanted movements, right. These are of different types. Chorea or what is called as choreiform movements, right. Ballism and dystonia. All these things we will discuss in greater detail in future class. For the purpose of this class, we will only discuss chorea of one type. Chorea itself is of multiple types. In this class, we will discuss the Huntington's chorea. In a future class, we will also discuss Sydenham's chorea. Okay. Chorea itself is of multiple types. Here, we will discuss Huntington's chorea. How is this caused? Let us remember once again the pathways. This is the indirect pathway and that is the direct pathway. So, depending on which part of the system is compromised, depending on which particular pathway is compromised, the response or the actual manifestation of the pathology is different, right. So, in the case of hypokinetic disorders such as Parkinson's disease, what happens is that the nigrostriatal neurons are the neurons from the substantia nigra pars compacta that produce dopamine and modulate the corticostriatal inputs or the thalamostriatal inputs actually are degenerating. Note the effect of dopamine on basal ganglia output or the thalamocortical neurons is always excitatory. In other words, whenever dopamine is coming, regardless of which pathway it goes through, it is going to always excite the output, not the medium spiny neurons, right, something to remember. So, suppose this dopaminergic input is compromised, the amount of dopamine that comes in is reduced for whatever reason, right. What happens is that the substantia nigra pars compacta neurons degenerate. Why do they degenerate? That is a topic that we will discuss in future class, right. So, for whatever reason, for the purpose of this class, it degenerates. Suppose it degenerates, what happens? The output of the indirect pathway is increased, right. Essentially the output of the indirect pathway is increased, whereas the output of the direct pathway is reduced, decreased, diminished. So, essentially the output from the subthalamic nucleus, which is excitatory, let us remember the subthalamic nucleus excites the globus pallidus internal segment, which in itself inhibits the thalamocortical neurons. So, the excitation going from the globus pallidus, so the excitation going from the subthalamic nucleus increases to the globus pallidus internal, which means that the inhibition going from the globus pallidus internal to the VAVL thalamus actually increases, not decreases, it increases. So, that means the inhibition increases, that means there is a less ability to produce wanted movements, right. So, essentially there is decreased excitation of the thalamocortical neurons, there is decreased excitation of the frontal cortex. Essentially the person wants to do something, but he is not able to do that act, right. The patient wants to do something, the patient wants to take a step, he is not able to take the step, right, which is what results in what is called as freezing of gait. What about the hyperkinetic disorder? Let us take the case of Huntington's disease. In this case what happens, there is selective degeneration of the medium spiny neurons in the indirect pathway. Let us remember what the indirect pathway does. The indirect pathway is essentially an inhibitory pathway. If this pathway is degenerated, what happens? The amount of inhibition that goes here will be reduced. Essentially the possibility that the thalamocortical neurons are going to be excited, or the probability that the thalamocortical neurons are going to be excited is increased, producing unwanted movement. So, essentially what happens? So, this pathway, what is this pathway? This is the indirect pathway. The indirect pathway is selectively degenerated, not the direct pathway. So, this does not have any effect on the direct pathway, right. The indirect pathway is selectively degenerated, essentially increasing the pallidal inhibition to the subthalamic nucleus, right. That means the subthalamic nucleus excitation to the globus pallidus internal segment is reduced, diminished. So, that means what happens? That means there is less inhibition. So, let us remember this is actually a tonic inhibition, right. So, the globus pallidus internal is tonically inhibiting the thalamocortical neurons. If this tonic inhibition is reduced for whatever reason, I am going to be producing unwanted movements, right. I am going to be producing unwanted movements, dance like movements. So, the word chorea comes from, right. It is also related to choreography, right. Choreography means as in dance, for example in movies. So, if the indirect pathway is selectively degenerated, what it does is it produces choreiform or dance like movements typical of Huntington's disease, right. This disease is also something that we will discuss in future classes, right. So, in summary, we have seen that diseases of basal ganglia can be divided into two types, or at least the movement related diseases of basal ganglia can be divided into two types, the hypokinetic diseases and the hyperkinetic disorders. In the hypokinetic case, the person wants to do something, but he is not able to do something. So, there is a disorder of movement initiation, and in the hyperkinetic case the person does not want to do something, but is doing something that is not wanted, such as dance like movements or choreiform movements, or like Huntington's chorea, right. Non-motor disorders of mood, behavior, cognition, for example obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, depression, right, and for example, behaving in a socially appropriate manner, for example, are also probably due to basal ganglia dysfunction, or in other words, basal ganglia is also implicated, or in other words, basal ganglia is also implicated in other disorders, not just motor disorders. And note, hypokinetic or hyperkinetic disorders themselves, for example, Parkinson's disease by itself can also have other effects on other pathways, for example, cognitive effects, for example, on mood. So, with this we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.